Good evening, and welcome to our live webcast of Open Book, Open Mind Online with Caitlin Petre, talking about her new book, All the News That's Fit to Click, How Metrics Are Transforming the Work of Journalists. The program is being co-presented by the New Jersey Society of Professional Journalists. I'm Ariel Zeitlin, one of the librarians at the Montclair Public Library. And first, I'd just like to draw your attention to the Q&A button. If you're using a computer or a smartphone, it's at the bottom of your screen. If you're using a tablet, it's at the top of your screen. That's how you can send us your questions for the Q&A period at the end of the conversation. And it's also how you can get live tech help from my librarian co-host, Alex Russo, at any time during the webcast. Now, I'd like to introduce Marnie Jessup, a member of the board of our Library Foundation. Welcome, Marnie.
Thank
So Marnie, are you going to tell us about the foundation?
Yeah. So we're so happy you're here for another virtual webcast of Open Book, Open Mind. I'd like to welcome everyone on behalf of the Montclair Public Library Foundation. We're a group of your friends and neighbors, and our mission is to raise money to fund the offerings that make our library so special. This includes library programs like this one, staff development, building restoration, and other needs that aren't covered by city funding. Your donations support everything from laptop lending, Wi-Fi hotspots for Montclair residents without internet access, to lifelong learning classes, homework tutoring, and resume help, to the children's reading programs, and most recently, the significant growth in e-content during the pandemic. So after you enjoy this event, please make a donation through our website, montclairplf.org. Gifts of all sizes have an impact, and the library needs your support now more than ever. Thank you very much, and please enjoy the program.
Thank you so much for all that you do, Marnie. And if anyone in the audience wants to contribute to the library in other ways, please search for Friends of the Montclair Public Library on our website or on Facebook. Now, I'm happy to introduce our guest this evening, Caitlin Petre. Caitlin is an assistant professor of journalism and media studies at Rutgers University, specializing in the social processes behind the digital data sets and algorithms that increasingly govern the contemporary world. She has been interviewed by the New York Times, The Atlantic, Wired, and the Columbia Journalism Review. Welcome, Caitlin.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Caitlin's book, All the News That's Fit to Click, is available to buy through our program partner, Watchung Booksellers, and to borrow at the library. Now, I'm also delighted to introduce Caitlin's conversation partner, Andrew Marantz. Andrew has been a staff writer at The New Yorker since 2011. He's written extensively for the magazine about technology, social media, the alt-right, and the press, as well as about comedy and pop culture. He's the author of Antisocial, Online Extremists, Techno-Utopians, and the Hijacking of the American Conversation, which he discussed on Open Book, Open Mind in 2020. Welcome back, Andrew.
Thank you.
Okay, so this is the moment we've all been waiting for. And for all of you at home, please remember that you can start submitting your questions while the conversation is going on. I'll be back after the Q&A.
Okay. Thank you very much. All right. Well, thank you, Caitlin, for doing this. This is, I think this is going to be a topic of great interest to everyone here. I mean, this is Montclair, so I assume that 60 to 70% of the audience works at the New York Times, but we're going to get into a lot of it. It really is a very readable book, but it also has a lot of rich, sociological theory in it. So there's a lot of directions we can go in. And I recommend it to everyone in the audience. Just to kind of start us off, the subtitle is How Metrics Are Transforming the Work of Journalists. And each of those words, work is an important word in there. transforming is an important word in there. I think a place to start is that you emphasize a few times that metrics are not the ultimate cause of the transformation of the industry, right? That this is sort of the egg, but not the chicken. So I guess given that, like, why is that? And given that, what made you want to focus on metrics even so?
Thank you so much, Andrew. That's a great question to start off with. I love questions that bring up context, right? Because I think that that's something that I worry is like can often get lost in conversations about new technologies. Is like, oh, this is making all these changes happen, when really, maybe there's a much longer process going on. And in journalism, right, that's 100% the case. And so, there were kind of signs of trouble for professional institutional journalism in the US long before the arrival of audience metrics on the scene, right? And so there were kind of many factors, a few of them, in the decades kind of leading up to the popularization of the internet, we saw kind of a massive deregulation of the media environment, a lot of mergers and acquisitions, kind of blending of media companies and news organizations into these kind of media mega conglomerates like McClatchy and Gannett, and so on. So that was one thing, that, for instance, kind of tends to, and studies have been done on this, push a newsroom towards kind of caring more about short-term profit of content, right? As opposed to like a longer-term investment. So that's one thing that was going on. And then also, then obviously, and this is a well-known story at this point, but obviously the rise of the internet and kind of decentralized media environment really meant, and the rise of the kind of tech platform companies really meant two things. It meant that the kind of online, basically the advertising revenue that so many news organizations depended on kind of bottomed out. So print advertising revenue plummeted, and then online advertising revenue existed, but news organizations didn't make all that much money from it because most of that money was going to these new players like Google and Facebook, who really came to dominate the online advertising market. And then players like Craigslist obviously came to dominate the classified advertising market. And so these were these kind of, so the media environment is consolidating. And then there's also these streams of revenue that had been pretty dependable for several decades that all of a sudden kind of start to plummet. So those were kind of two of the contextual factors. And then I think a third one that's really interesting and sort of underexplored, but is certainly has come up in your work, I believe too, is that there's been a declining trust in journalists and journalism, right, among the American people. And that's actually, there's kind of declining trust in many different institutions, but the news media has seen these precipitous drops in trust. And so that's also happening. And it's happening, long before Trump and kind of in the decades leading up to the rise of the internet. And so there are these things going on that that predate the entrance of metrics into the newsroom. There are really there's more cultural pressures, there's more economic pressures sort of bearing down on the newsroom. And none of that really has anything to do with metrics. But I was interested in metrics and in studying metrics because metrics became one of the most vivid and visible ways that those pressures, and particularly the economic pressures, started to get right in front of journalists' faces as they're trying to do their jobs, right? So you may kind of know on an abstract level, oh, your organization isn't like doing so well, or advertising revenue is not great, right? But because most news organizations had sort of had that wall that was separating the editorial side from the advertising side, it wasn't kind of constantly in your face in a newsroom, but metrics come in and they really put traffic and audiences and clicks and these kind of quantified measures of audience behavior and popularity of content right in front of journalists' faces. And so I thought, oh, what an interesting sort of symbol of these changes, and what an interesting symptom of these broader things that are going on, and the way that they kind of become crystallized in this image of the dashboard. So that was one of the reasons I thought it was fascinating.
Yeah, that makes sense. And we should probably get a little specific about the dashboard and how it works. And maybe, for the 35% of the audience that doesn't work at the New York Times, we can just sort of define what metrics are generally, but then also specifically how Chartbeat works and why you decided to do fieldwork starting at Chartbeat.
Great, yeah. So So metrics can mean a whole lot of different things, right? And metrics is just basically a quantity that measures something, in its broadest form. In terms of journalism, metrics can also mean a bunch of different things. So we have metrics that sort of co-evolved with the rise of the internet, like the page view, right? Or the click. That was sort of the classic old school metric, which was just simply a count of, how many clicks were there on this link, to this news article, right? And then over time, these tools have kind of gotten a lot more sophisticated and more granular. So you start to see, as the years pass, you start to see the emergence of a focus on unique visitors. So not just did someone, did this story get X many clicks, but how many people came to the New Yorker's website that were new to us this month, right? And then go a few years later and you start to see the emergence of, and this is, I think, where things really start to get super fascinating and what I focus on in the book, where you start to see the emergence of real-time metrics. So previous to Chartbeat, which is the analytics company that I focus on in the book, previous to Chartbeat, most newsroom analytics, to the extent that analytics were even in newsrooms, were historical, right? So you would get a snapshot, like maybe a little, PDF or an image in your email saying, hey, here's what your clicks were for last month, or here's what your unique views were, or visitors for the last week, right? Or even the last 24 hours, but it's still a static thing. Chartbeat comes on the scene and says, we've made a tool that's real time. So you're going to have a dashboard, and it looks very kind of like a cross between a car's dashboard and a video game, basically. If for those of you who have never seen the Chartbeat dashboard, and it's going to show you in real time how many people are entering the site. So if you're looking at the Chartbeat dashboard, there's actually a count called the concurrence count that's showing you how many people are on that news site at that exact moment that you're looking, and the number kind of rises and falls as people come and leave, right? And it goes much deeper than that. They can also measure things like scroll depth. So this is a metric that shows, how far do people typically get down through your article before they get bored and click on something else, basically. And then there's also lots of data about social sharing, social media engagement around news and things like that. So I think, one of the reasons I was interested in Chartbeat was because it had kind of pioneered this real time, let's show journalists these things as they're happening, right? Let's show like people clicking away as it's happening. And then the other reason I was fascinated by Chartbeat is because when kind of metrics like first come on the scene in the news business, there was a lot of anxiety about them. There was a lot of, sometimes even sort of hostility towards them. Just a sense, I think, among many professional journalists of, I want the audience to be at a remove. I don't want to just write about what's popular and what's getting a lot of attention. I get it. I know that sex sells and whatever, but that's not what I'm doing. And so I don't need to have that data in my face. So there was a lot of kind of trepidation about bringing metrics into the editorial workflow. And somehow Chartbeat got their foot in the door, right? They figured out a way to become kind of widely institutionalized in a vast array of newsrooms in the US and around the world. And so I was kind of curious, like, well, how are they doing that, right? Like, how are they winning over this group of professionals who has historically been disinterested and sometimes even actively uninterested in wanting to know how content is performing in terms of audience behavior?
Yeah, and I often play the role of the sort of disinterested / scornful of metrics journalist. So I'm happy to play that role at some point in our conversation. But just from a descriptive sociological point of view, I think it's interesting that you talk about the real-time dashboard effect, and you talk about the kind of tailorization of journalism and the kind of the effect that that the kind of mechanization, time study, de-skilling effect that this can have. Yeah. Just on an intuitive level, it seems a little counterintuitive, right? That employees, and not particularly well-paid employees on average, are clamoring to see the raw data with which they will be assessed and possibly fired, right? It's like if you work at an Amazon warehouse, you don't see a lot of people saying, oh, please show me the real-time dashboard of how quickly I'm packing boxes, right? So what is your kind of explanation for why journalists start to clamor for seeing this information as opposed to, as you say, holding it at a remove?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a few things going on there, right? So I think, one of the things is that if listen, like if your job security depends on those stats, you actually might be like, I need to get in there, right? Like I need to know what my situation is. And in fact, I always thought this was so interesting. In 2015, the Washington Post's editorial union was renegotiating their contract. And one of the things that they asked for from management, one of the things they wanted was more access to metrics. And their reasoning was, we're seeing this stuff start to come up in performance reviews. We're seeing it start to affect the way we're evaluated in our jobs. And so we kind of have a right to know, and we have a right to see, and we have a right to understand the ways in which, this data is being used to make decisions about our jobs. So I do think that that's part of it. But I think that there's also something, and then I think like there's another thread of it, which is just that none of us can resist like knowing how we're doing, right? Like there's just this sort of innate, and there's even a version of this in academia. If there are any academics on this webinar, we have something called academia.edu or something else called ResearchGate. And academia.edu like sends you emails no matter how many times you ask them not to, where they say things like, you've reached a new milestone, and in academia, that means like your paper got, 1 citation or something, like that's what counts for. But, so I like roll my eyes when it shows up in my inbox, but I'm clicking on it and I want to see, like I want to know because I worked hard on that thing. So I think there is something about this that just like taps into this deep, wanting to be liked. And I think that in some ways, like management can almost leverage that need, or like, weaponize is too strong a word, but certainly leverage it. And then the other piece of this, I think, has to do with Chartbeat. And I paid a lot of attention to sort of user experience design and the way that Chartbeat is designed, the way it looks, the way it feels to use, right? If you ask a lot of journalists, like, and I have asked a lot of journalists, like, what's your relationship to Chartbeat? I would always ask that question in interviews. And the first word I would hear almost always was, I'm addicted to it, right? Like it's addicted. And I think that's really fascinating to me, to not just want to see these metrics because, your job might depend on it, but to actually feel like you can't stop looking at them, right? Like I would have journalists tell me that, they'd be out at a bar with their friends and be opening up the Chartbeat app, like on a Friday night, looking to see how their post had done. And not because of any like immediate fear of being fired or something, just like really absorbed in the tool. And I think one of the things that Chartbeat did very effectively in terms of user experience design is to kind of forge this emotional relationship directly with the journalist, right? Directly with the rank and file journalist, as opposed to management, right? Like, or your editor saying, you have to use this tool and you have to check it 5 times a day. The tool is quite compelling. You kind of get sucked into it. And then you feel like you're checking Chartbeat, like it's your choice to be doing that, as opposed to coming from these kind of economic or managerial pressures. And a writer at Gawker said to me, I check Chartbeat on my phone. I shouldn't, like I'm not supposed to look at metrics. So it was even this feeling of like, I'm doing something illicit, right? Because I'm so into this. And I think that Chartbeat was just very effective at making it feel like, this isn't coming from the top down, right? This is a relationship that you as the journalist have to this tool that's going to make you work harder, but not because you're being told to, because journalists probably wouldn't like that.
Right.
But couldn't really seem like that. Yeah.
Right. And we should talk about the illicitness of it. I mean, you mentioned the comparison to dirty work and the comparison to sex work, which was made explicit by Gawker. I think in order to get into that, we should, just to concretize it for the audience, this is not a phrase that I maybe have ever said before, but you have a fascinating methodological appendix my
gosh, I'm gonna cry.
Thank you
so much.
Because it tells, how you did the research and how you sort of, hopscotched from one place to the next, and why you picked each place, and how your, I would call it reporting, but you would call it fieldwork, in Gawker was so different from what you did at the time. So just run us through, we now have what brought you to Chartbeat and sort of, how you research the rest of the book, because I think it'll lay the groundwork for, when we get to Gawker and all that stuff.
Yeah. So I'm a sociologist by training. And so, I'm engaged, the kind of methodological tradition that I'm coming from is called, participant observation or ethnography, which, and then also with interviews as part of that. Right. And so, so yeah, it's not kind of unlike really in-depth reporting in some ways, right? And you're kind of trying to go to a place and sort of immerse yourself in what's going on there and figure out what's happening there. What are the rhythms of life there or of work there? And, you know, and what is it kind of like to be a part of this place? How do things work? What are the rules and so on? And so in ethnography, you have to pick a site, right? Or a few sites. I did like a multi-sited ethnography for this book, but you have to choose the sites really carefully because you're sort of trying to choose sites that will be kind of analytically relevant. So not just going to the New York Times because it's the New York Times and we should care about what happens there. It's a really important organization in and of itself, but also because it can speak to kind of these broader themes about, in the case of the Times, an organization that really is the kind of classic legacy organization that's really building on a 150-year-old history, and trying to kind of pivot that into these new modes of media production and distribution. And so that was one of the reasons I wanted to go to the Times, is I thought, this is just, you almost couldn't, if you want to understand kind of like how metrics are influencing traditional journalism, like maybe go to the most traditional place in a sense. And then I thought, but I also want to go to a place that's sort of the opposite of that. And that was what led me to Gawker. So when I think about, I'm going to be like nerdy for a second, but I feel like since you read the appendix, I can do that. Like this is a safe place to do that. But when I think about the research design of the study, it was sort of a triangle. So I thought of Chartbeat at the top right there. I wanted to study how their analytics tool was designed and marketed. But then I wanted to follow the tool and into two different newsrooms that are very different from each other in terms of structure, organizational culture, and so on. But they're using the same tool, right? So both the New York Times and Gawker both have Chartbeat, right? They both have the same tool. That part is constant, but all this other stuff is different. And so I thought that would be a really interesting way to compare. Okay, you take this analytics tool and you want to see how it plays out. How is it implemented? How do people deal with it and respond to it in these two very different organizations? And so the Times was sort of my legacy traditional journalism organization. And then Gawker, I'd always been fascinated by Gawker, and I they were known for a lot of things, but one of the things they were sort of most known for was their kind of unabashed, like almost contrarian embrace of metrics and editorial work. Like that was part of the brand, right? Is like, yeah, we want to know, like we want to do the stuff that, so the big board, which was this famous thing at Gawker, which ranked posts according to popularity and was displayed on the wall of their offices. Now that's like so normal, but back then it was a big deal. Gawker designed that sort of in communication with Chartbeat, right? So this was like a co-production of Gawker and Chartbeat. So I thought, wow, I want to go to this place where, it's a newsroom or news organization that seems so comfortable with this stuff and so kind of deeply into it, and see how they use the same tool that's also being implemented at the Times.
Mm-hmm. Well, and we should talk about people's comfort or discomfort with this stuff, because journalism, you have several points in the book where you point out the degree to which, journalism is like other forms of work and the extent to which it isn't like other forms of work. And so maybe one way of getting into that is, you mentioned field theory in the book, and, how there are different ways of gauging the value of one's work. There are some kinds of work where the value is clear. Did you meet the target of widgets? Did you get a promotion? Is your company solvent? Did you get a good exit from a VC? Journalism isn't like that. So maybe we can talk about all these intersecting value systems that are usually implicit, usually not explicitly talked about, and how that shows up differently in a place like Gawker or a place like the Times. And maybe also with a little bit of just implicit in that, like what Gawker was when you first got there, and what about it surprised you or didn't surprise you?
Yeah. Journalism is a really funny type of work for the reasons that you said, right? So it's not, it's not like the type of work that can be so easily quantified, like how many, what's your production quota of making widgets or something like that. But it's also not like being, a tenured physicist at a university where there's almost no connection, where it's sort of completely severed from like a profit incentive. So journalism is sort of fascinating because it's kind of trapped between those two things, right? And so, so journalists are in a position where they're navigating kind of all the time. I would say like multiple aims, right? Because we have a very heavily commercialized media system in the U.S. So most news organizations here are for profit. So they're navigating these kind of business or economic pressures that are there. That have always been there, but they bubble up to more salience at certain moments, like the one we're in now. And then they also got these civic aims, right? But even those, there's so many qualitatively different ones, right? Like, trying to do the kind of deep investigative journalism that ProPublica does is very different from a site that's like hyper local and wants to help people in the community, know how the trash pickup went in the local park. Like, that's not like a super profit oriented thing necessarily, and it's civic, but it's very different from what ProPublica is doing. And so, and even in the Pulitzer Prizes, right? Like if you want to go into field theory and you think of, what's the indication of the most cultural capital, the most prestige in journalism is probably winning a Pulitzer Prize. There's so many different types of Pulitzer Prizes for so many different types of reporting. And so journalism has always had this really kind of complex, like multifaceted set of aims that is reaching for. And at certain moments, like the one that we saw in the starting, I would say, like, in the 1990s and then moving into the aughts and now, you start to see like the economic pressures bear down and bear down and bear down. And all of a sudden these tensions kind of come to the fore. So it's not that they haven't been there, but they're really salient. And metrics become one of the ways that they become very visible. So as a form of work, I think in some sense, journalism is kind of like in a land of its own, although I did start to look into, in researching this book, a lot of literature on, artistic workers, like people who work in cultural industries, right? Book publishing, filmmaking, like those sorts of workers. And that's interesting too, because in a sense, there's always also been that kind of art commerce tension. So, when metrics enter into a field like that, it's really tricky because metrics kind of take all that complexity and they just want to sand it away, because that's what quantification sort of does. It's a tool of simplification in a way. And so, that's one of the reasons that, and I write about this in the book, that metrics for news are so hard to interpret. Like there's no clear, it's not like, well, this person made more widgets than this person and therefore had a more productive day. Like because there's so many different kind of modes of things you could be measuring. So I end up kind of categorizing journalism as a form of knowledge work, by which I mean people who are engaged in the production and dissemination of knowledge. And I think that some of the tensions that journalists are wrestling with metrics they're coming for academics, they're coming for many other types of workers that have sort of traditionally been somewhat buffered from these kinds of production pressures that we more typically associate with like a factory shop floor.
Mm-hmm. And did you, you mentioned that there's a kind of folk theory aspect to a lot of the theories that people will form, because as you say, just to give people an example of how this Chartbeat stuff works, there is a lot of detail and a lot of different ways you can navigate the dashboard, but at the end of the day, it's a number, or it's some kind of quantitative measure. And so what that doesn't give you is, as you say, what the news mix was, whether you published your tilapia investigation the day of the Bin Laden raid, these things don't show up on Chartbeat. What you're seeing is numbers. I mean, any more than your car's dashboard tells you whether there's traffic out in front of you,
You're just going 5 miles an hour. Like, who knows?
Right.
Yeah.
Right. You must be a bad driver.
Yeah.
So what did you experience since a lot of this was based on observation and interviews? What was the range of what you experienced from journalists in terms of resentment, trepidation? One of my favorite examples of this is the Politburo example from Gawker, but you can sort of go in any direction you want in terms of how people were wrestling with this in their work lives.
Yeah, I mean, one of the top line things that struck me very soon into the research, and it was true, especially at Gawker, because metrics were so front and center there, but also at the Times, was like just how emotional people got really lathered up about these numbers. And I remember.
And sorry, I meant to tell you, if you could just, for people who have never read Gawker, just sort of what it was, especially at that time, it's changed a lot now, but.
Yes, it has changed a lot now.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Gawker. Oh, how to characterize Gawker? So Gawker was a network. It was a independently owned company owned by this entrepreneur Nick Denton, and it had, at the time I was there, it had 8 different sites, and so the company was Gawker Media, and that was sort of the umbrella. But then they had Gawker, which was a site that was devoted to kind of a mix of media gossip, celebrity gossip, politics. Then they had, Jezebel, which was like a women's issues feminist site. And then they had, Gizmodo, which was about consumer tech. They had Jalopnik, which was about car culture. And then, several more, some of them on kind of pretty niche topics. And then some of them on, like, Deadspin was a sports site that had a big readership. And so, but Gawker was known for having, I would say, an editorial sensibility that was kind of came out of, in some sense, like the tabloid tradition of journalism. And so there was this sense that they like took a lot of pleasure in slaughtering some of the sacred cows of traditional journalistic norms and practice. And so, that led a lot of people to sort of write them off as being unserious, frivolous, like silly, stupid site. But actually they were, and there was some of that stuff for sure, but they were doing a lot of interesting, like some really interesting original reporting, a lot of interesting commentary. And they were also kind of, I think when they first were going, they were sort of really taking legacy journalism to task for being kind of too cozy with the people that they were supposed to cover, in a way that I think kind of was like a wake-up call in some sense in the New York media world. So that's a little bit of context about Gawker, for those who may not be familiar with it. Let's go back to your other question.
Yeah. So I
okay.
interrupted you, but yeah, about kind of how individual journalists dealt with these pressures. And did you see change over time?
Yeah. So, it was really interesting. I mean, I would say, right. So the intensity of the emotions really struck me, right? So there was a writer at Gawker who told me that he talked to his therapist about his traffic. Like this was like a kind of regular topic in therapy because it was so influential over his mood. And so if he would, if he had a crappy traffic day, like he would talk about that in therapy. And, and similarly, like one of the most interesting experiences I had during field work was being kind of on group chat for one of the Gawker media sites as they did a day of work, like what's it like in there. Now they'd be on Slack. Back then it was called Campfire, the program they use. But then as I'm on the group chat, I'm also IMing independently, just one-on-one with the editor of that site. And they were having a low traffic day, and she was kind of spinning out. Like she was really telling me, like, I feel desperate, I feel worried, I feel anxious. What am I going to do? And it just like, so the level of stress. And then the next day and said, today's way better. I feel great, but it's that sort of like, that's the real time effect, right? Is like, you only feel as good as it's going that day for you. And I think, some terms of resentment, I mean, sometimes there was resentment, but not as much as you might have expected for like a tool of essentially managerial surveillance and productivity extraction. Like there wasn't that much resentment. It was at the Times, reporters actually weren't oops, my computer's falling over. At the time that I was at the Times, reporters actually weren't given access to Chartbeat or analytics. And so there was sort of some people at the Times who had been there a really long time tended to be sort of like indifferent, like I don't even, like, who cares, that's not my job. But a lot of the newer reporters who are kind of coming in and building a career were like, I want to get at that stuff. Like, how do I need to know what's going on. So they were interested in it and were kind of trying to find backdoors to get to the data. Ultimately, the Times did roll out the data to the newsroom, much more broadly, and built their own tool and stuff. And then at Gawker, I would say people experienced stress about it, but they also experienced like kind of competition with each other that felt enlivening to them. Like it was really tied in with adrenaline, I think, and brought a lot of like adrenaline to their jobs in a way that I think ultimately pushed them to work harder, which is one of the reasons why I sort of saw it as akin to, some of these techniques that we see in industrial work from, the early 20th century about how to extract more productivity from workers by monitoring them very closely as they do their work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's why, in addition to sort of being depressing that you would be checking this at a bar on a Friday night, it's also interesting that you can sort of incite people into having this personal relationship with their means of surveillance, even as they know that's what's happening. I mean, these are not people who are naive to this fact.
Not at
It's
all.
just
No.
that the addiction kind of overrides it.
Yeah.
I mean, did you did you ever sort of talk about the surveillance aspect of it with the people that you were reporting on? I mean, or researching, or was that sort of in the background?
I would say that the time that it's so this process is sort of like you're doing it and things are occurring to you and you're realizing things as you go, and that so I didn't kind of like the argument of the book kind of came from what I was observing in interviews and in the site. So not in so many words, but I think there were moments when I would sort of say, especially at Gawker, I'd be like, help me understand this, right? Like, so for example, I was really interested in the relationship between, and I am still, more broadly than journalism, but what's the relationship between kind of how your boss monitors your performance and how autonomous or not autonomous you feel in your job, like your perception of your autonomy in the workplace. And one of the things that was fascinating about Gawker is that they had, they're ranked individually on traffic, like they can access their stats at any time. They have this big, screen on the wall of the office that's showing which posts are doing the best. And, it seemed to me like a pretty stressful, work environment, and they were stressed about traffic a lot of the time. But then, a lot of them had also turned down job offers from places where they wouldn't have had that same pressure, or they had gone to work at other news organizations and come back to work at Gawker. And, and there's a selection bias there, obviously, but it was really interesting because I would say, like, but you're so stressed, like, why would you come back here? And they would always give the same answer, was like, I have so much autonomy here. I can write whatever I want here, right? Like, which to me was so fascinating, because it's like, we think of autonomy as being, I'm not being surveilled necessarily as I do my job. And yet they were, but they still felt that sense of autonomy. And that got to sort of one of the more unexpected, surprising things for me, I think, which was that, as I started to dive deeper into this and think of this as like a working conditions issue, I thought, okay, well, this is a story of just, like metrics enabled managerial domination, right? But actually, it was more complicated, because you started to see moments where journalists at the Times and at Gawker would sort of try to leverage their data in ways that could gain advantage for them in their careers, or get, better placement for a story or things like that. And so there was this kind of ongoing contestation or back and forth, I would say, about who's going to access this data, who's going to get to tell a story with it, right? Like, who's going to decide what it means that so-and-so's article got this many page views, and what should happen on the basis of that. So, I think that that was really interesting too. Like, there were times when the journalists could sort of grab a little like leverage from these metrics as well. And the example that you brought up of the Politburo, for anyone who's not familiar with that, there was this kind of right towards the tail end of my work at Gawker, there was a new editorial director who wanted to kind of de-emphasize metrics a little bit in the Gawker culture. And so one of the things he did is they had this traffic-based bonus. Like, if you get, if your site gets this past a certain traffic target, you'll, as a site, be eligible for a bonus, and the editor of that site can dispense the bonus as they want. And he said, no, we're not going to do that anymore. And instead, there's going to be a group of kind of top editorial staff that are going to really look through all of the kind of the posts submitted by editors from the different Gawker sites that the editors think are the best for each month. And we're going to decide, where we think the bonus should go, right? So that's really trying to bring back in like all that complexity, and bring back in the idea, like the Pulitzers, right? Like, journalism should be judged by journalists, like the quality of it. And this was like not actually a particularly popular move at Gawker. Like, the editorial director, I interviewed him, and he said, no, I think a lot of people kind of felt like they'd rather just, like, they didn't trust me to do it. Like, they just wanted to know, what the stats had been. And so, I think that we can learn two things from that. One is, at a place where metrics become deeply, deeply woven into the institutional culture, like Gawker, it's hard to move away from that, right? Like, they become very, very strongly influential, and it's hard to see other modes of evaluation as legitimate. And this is true of quantification. Like, there's a whole sociology of quantification subfield, and this is found in many domains. that numbers tend to be a very like cognitively powerful form of evaluation that can drown out other modes of evaluation. So I think that's one thing. And then the second thing is I think it shows that some of the writers really felt like metrics benefited them, right? Like, what if your editor doesn't care about the kind of things that you cover and doesn't think they're important or interesting? And therefore you never get the bonus or you never get a promotion, right? If you've got the data in your pocket, that's another yardstick by which you can sort of measure how you're doing.
I mean, it seems that this isn't really a sociology of work question. This is a broader, kind of cultural sociology question, but it seems that we have a kind of vexed or ambivalent relationship to popularity as opposed to inherent quality as a culture. It sort of reminds me of when you talk about marshaling data to prove your point, if there's a political poll you like that says, 90% of people believe there should be common sense gun control, you marshal that as why don't we have common sense gun control? If there's a poll that says 50% of people think that, we shouldn't have democratic elections, you kind of say, oh, well, people are misinformed and we should really inform the public better. You reach a different conclusion with the data. So, and, you see this with, if your favorite stand-up comedian sells out Madison Square Garden, you say, see, this comedian is so great. If someone you think is a hack sells out Madison Square Garden, you say, see, he's a hack, that's why he gets such a big crowd. So, I mean, did you sort of reach any, through your research, like, did you come to arrive at any kind of, were you able to settle that kind of dichotomous relationship to, the intrinsic value or, and I mean, it comes up in academia too, right? If someone has a really high impact score, that's because they're great, or that's because there's just a rank popularizer, so right. How do you settle that in your mind?
Oh gosh. Well, the short answer is it did not solve the vexed relationship between quality and popularity, right? Like it remains vexed, unfortunately. But I think that, what you point to is such a key point, especially in this era where we tend to put so much faith in data and so much faith in data science and algorithms, right? Which is that, obviously there's no such thing as raw data, but there's also no such thing as like, the data doesn't lie. Like the fact is that, right? Because we have to tell stories with data. Like we can interpret a data point in so many different ways, depending on, what we think, whether we like that comedian or not, right? Mm-hmm. I think that one of the things that that is really has been interesting to see in journalism as it has continued to evolve in this realm is that there seems to be like a hunt, an ongoing quest for the metric that's going to unvex the vexed relationship, right? Like we just haven't found the metric that's going to make it so that the stories that are the most democratically relevant are also the most popular, right? So at first it was, well, we see this disconnect because we're measuring clicks and clicks are terrible, right? Or we see this disconnect because we're measuring uniques and, that doesn't take into account loyal readers. And then there was an idea of, well, now we need to be measuring engagement. And when you measure engagement and time spent, that's when you see this kind of alignment between quality and popularity, right? If you look at the right thing. But then we know from like the Frances Haugen Facebook Files reporting, this big shift to time spent and engagement actually doesn't end up being the sort of silver bullet metric that's going to erase the contradictions in this relationship. And so I think that in some sense, we still have this desire to like want metrics to solve that problem for us, to want to find the right thing to measure that's going to make it so that, in journalism's case, like journalism doesn't have this tension between its commercial aims and its civic aims. And I just don't think, I don't think that's going to happen through finding the right way to quantify an audience's behavior.
Yes. I think that's a great place to land on. I think we are finally, well, it depends who the we is, but I think a lot of people are finally out of the mugs game of seeking to find the perfect golden metric. And I think I agree that that's all to the good. So I'm going to go to a few of the audience's questions. I have plenty of other things that I want to ask. So, but I'll just, people have been sending in some really good questions. So we have a question here from Joanne. Do the metrics on Chartbeat make journalists work harder or differently? In other words, going after the sexy story that garners clicks, the car accident versus the town planning board.
Mm-hmm. Great question. So yes, is the short answer to that. I mean, certainly make them work harder, right? So, and I think the real-time aspect is key here, right? Because I have this quote from one of the journalists I interviewed at Gawker, where it was so striking. He said, Chartbeat is, he said, I think I've memorized it. He said, Chartbeat is rough because it's relentless. There's no time when you can close your laptop and say, oh, our traffic's done for the day, right? He said, you can always try something else. You can always, tweak the headline and see if you can get a little bit more juice on Facebook, or you can change out the share image and see if maybe that, right? So he's sort of, even after he's written the story, he's engaging in this continual labor of like editorial optimization, I guess is probably what I would call it. This kind of tinkering around the edges and trying to see, in real time, like, is it having an effect? Is it having an effect? Is it having an effect? And so, there's no point at which you can say, oh, we did it. Like we've reached sufficient traffic, right? And we're finished. And so I think that, traffic, in the book, I call it like the traffic game, right? Because it did have sort of game-like properties, and the game is never over. Like you're always trying to best your high score or your coworker's high score or whatever. And so I do think that extracts more productivity. Like it makes you work harder, right? Because there is all this extra work to do to try to make news, distributable and visible on all these different platforms, but also because, you're never done. The traffic's, if that's the barometer, like there's never enough of it. There's never enough traffic. So I think that's the answer to the harder part. The differently part is trickier. Certainly, I think there's an opportunity cost. So I saw this at Gawker, right? Like they had certain kind of, some formal at some sites, others not so much, but kind of unspoken like post quotas. Like I've just gotta, we've got to keep this stuff on the site fresh and novel. And so that means we have to turn out a lot of new stuff. And so that means that, maybe I'm not working on this kind of long, deeply reported feature that I want to be working on. So certainly different in that sense. In terms of whether it reshaped like the editorial sensibility, that I didn't see as much evidence of, honestly. Like I think people who wanted to work at Gawker already didn't mind, writing about a sex scandal or something, like they were sort of like on board for that kind of thing. So that was part of it. But I think also that that they just sort of wanted to do everything. Like they still wanted to do the longer reported stuff, but they also needed to do churn out pieces to go up on the site and keep it novel. And they also needed to do all the social media optimizing stuff. And so it just ended up that they worked harder and harder. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And there was some amount of division of labor, but yeah, if you're sharing your editorial DNA with tabloids, as you said, there's not as much of a disconnect as there might be elsewhere. So we have some Chartbeat specific questions. Well, here's a question from Shep. Is Chartbeat affordable for startup niche publications?
Good question. So I may not have like the fullest up-to-date knowledge on their product line because I did this research, some years ago, but at least I can speak to at the time, they had a kind of but I'll talk about two versions of the product. So they had product, which was called Chartbeat Publishing. And that was the kind of souped up, like all the bells and whistles, fullest expression of Chartbeat, which was really used by more established, like bigger sites, basically, that had a little bit more resources to put behind it. They also did have a product though, called Chartbeat Basic, that they did market specifically to the kind of sites you're asking about. So smaller sites that didn't have as much of a budget. One thing that was really fascinating is that the Times, when I was at Chartbeat, the Times still had the Chartbeat Basic. So they had gone with the version that was like fewer bells and whistles, which I think reflects like their ambivalence about bringing this stuff into the editorial work process. But yes, I mean, they had kind of different products for different resource levels. Yeah. And
this is outside of your research scope, but do you have any thoughts about Crowdtangle as a kind of successor or not successor to Chartbeat? And I mean, I guess what that question gets at is, when these things are specifically embedded in Facebook or within social media, does that fundamentally change the calculus?
Yeah, it's interesting. So Crowdtangle, is it owned by?
It was. They just spun it off.
Yeah. Okay. So so that's interesting, right? Like there was a time at which, so Chartbeat was very much a tool that was built for a news landscape where, publishers were posting their stuff on social media, but they weren't kind of making content to live on social media only, right? They still had their own servers and their own sites, and Chartbeat was not as much designed for, you know, sites like that were really, or when, you know, sites started, like the whole thing that happened with native articles where, you know, newspapers and other media companies were publishing kind of direct to Facebook, and the content lived in Facebook. You know, that shift was actually not very amenable to Chartbeat because they couldn't really get in there, right? Like that, then the analytics become the purview of the social media company. So I think my understanding of Crowdtangle is limited, but I think it was more kind of oriented around like having that kind of data for like that really focused specifically on social media distribution, as opposed to the sort of model of metrics that sees a news site as being like the locus of the publication, if that makes sense. Yeah. But you probably know more about that, like more about Crowdtangle or all the journals.
Yeah. No, it's an interesting.
So if I got that wrong, let me know.
No, that sounds right. But it's just an interesting evolution of the kind of surveillance aspect of it. Do you, okay, so this is from Victor. The question is, could we think of Wikipedia as a solution to the influence of metrics on journalism? And I think this is kind of Wikipedia as a metaphor, because he goes on, what if the journalistic artifact were not reliant on a very small number of people and their ethics, but rather dozens of anonymous authors checking each other to get closer to the truth?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I mean, it's so funny because I just actually there's a doctoral student at Rutgers who just did a dissertation on some of the like Wiki News, which was a kind of spin-off project of Wikipedia, and All Voices, which was another kind of attempt to do this kind of crowdsourced, distributed, decentralized news production that I think you're getting at, right? Like a Wikipedia model. They did not succeed. Like they have not been successful. I think there's a lot of reasons for that. You know, one is that unlike Wikipedia, like news tends to be a fast. Like you gotta kind of turn it around because its recency is often relevant to its success, and quickness is not necessarily a strength of like these kind of crowdsourced projects. But I also think that, you know, in a sense, like we're sort of seeing a version of that gone wrong, like on Facebook with the kind of stuff that Andrew has written about, right? Like, or the, you know, some of these like far right types of media sites and media like kind of platforms that where people are sort of producing memes and kind of news and kind of commentary and kind of like and everything is sort of circulating in a free-for-all. So I don't, you know, I don't see necessarily a lot of hope for a Wikipedia style thing to work for journalism and move it away from metrics. What I do see that's hopeful, a couple things, you know, like so one of the interesting things that happened in the aftermath of Gawker kind of imploding or really being sued out of business is that, you know, eventually some of the Gawker sites were bought by a private equity firm, and which immediately started clashing with the longtime Gawker staffers, and partly over traffic because the private equity people wanted, you know, page views to quadruple, and the Gawker people were not against traffic, but they were like, that's not how it works, you know, like that's not how we do this. And some of them actually kind of left and started their own like worker-owned site called Defector Media. So I'm actually trying to study them right now. Like, I think that's a really interesting model. I'm fascinated to see how some of these questions about, you know, working conditions and labor, how they manifest when the ownership structure is completely different, right? Like when the ownership, the journalists own the newsroom, they own the organization, but they're still subject to some of the same pressures in the media environment. I also think we've seen a really interesting, you know, fascinating wave of unionization, obviously, across the US digital journalism business. So that's, I think, a hopeful sign, and one that's really interesting to me. So I think that we see, and then there's also been the other major trend, I would say, that's really changed since I concluded most of this field work is that there's been this shift to subscriber-based revenue models for many news organizations. So places like the New Yorker already had paywalls and were, that was really like a key part of the business, Wall Street Journal. But by and large, like that was really not the model for a long time, and organizations were trying to make it work with digital ad revenue, and it wasn't working. And so, we've seen this shift to paywalls and subscriptions, and I think in some sense that's hopeful because it means that it kind of takes away a little bit of that reliance on Facebook and Google for distribution. on the other hand, and reliance on advertising as well, but on the other hand, it does kind of inherently and by definition make the news less accessible to people who can't pay for it. So, so there's sort of things that are shifting that I think some of them are kind of hopeful signs. I'm interested to see how they develop. And yeah, that was a long answer to your question about Wikipedia, but hopefully I got there.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's and I'll add to the shout out to Defector Media. Everyone should subscribe. I'm a subscriber. I think it's a really interesting model. They do not stick to sports.
They do not.
They do not. Do you, okay, so there's a couple more good ones. I'm gonna try to move quickly, but these are all good.
Okay.
This is, well, one is just an observation, which says, as a newsroom person, one thing I've noticed over many years of using Chartbeat and many other tools is that the folks who had control over the access would rarely write a story and test Chartbeat on themselves. So that's an interesting thing to observe.
That's fascinating.
Yeah. This one is a yes or no question, which I think we'll get a no, but I don't want to prejudice you. Can you draw a conclusion about whether this quantification is increasing or decreasing the civic value of the journalism being produced? Does it make the journalism more partisan / biased in that the journalists must be tempted to play to what their readers want to read?
This is a great question. This is a question that keeps me up at night. I'm going to try not to have an existential crisis while answering it, but I think, so the reason this question is tricky to answer, right, is because is for two reasons. So one is that, my study, because I was focused on journalists and the way they do their work, I did not do, a content analysis where I'm looking at the way that journalistic, the mix of stories and how much of it is about climate change versus Kim Kardashian over time and whether that changes, right? So I wasn't able to do that kind of systematic analysis of trends in content. Some scholars are doing that and they're working on it. It is tricky though to do this because it's really hard to tell a causal story. It's really hard to know what, whether let's say there is more celebrity coverage now, right? Is that because journalists have metrics? Is that because there's, we're seeing sort of a case of market failure where there's just not the kind of money available. There's not the kind of business structure and market available to support the kind of news that democracy needs, in which case metrics could be a symptom of that problem, but that's the problem, right? The problem is that we have a very heavily marketized media system at a time when the market is not particularly friendly to civically valuable journalism. And so anyway, it's just a really, really tricky question. I would say that to the extent, I'll speak to what I did observe, which is to the extent that, there's a great team of media researchers who say, they talk about media work and they're mostly looking at artistic fields, but they say, it's fair to assume that poor working conditions, right? Work that's boring, work that's badly compensated, work that's insecure, where you feel like you're never sure when you're going to get laid off, right? It's fair to say that probably worsens the quality of the thing that you're making, whether that is art or whether that is journalism, right? That just kind of makes sense. And so, I did observe, I think, kind of a degradation in some sense of journalistic working conditions that metrics kind of help to facilitate. And so I think that it's, and I certainly saw people pressuring themselves to work harder, to produce more, to rush. So I think in that sense, we can start to draw these connections, but I just don't want to overclaim because again, I didn't really do a systematic analysis of content. And even if you do, it's hard to know what's causing the trends that you're seeing.
And I'll just throw in one more data point, which is, not everything moves in the same direction that everyone might assume. I mean, I worry as much about the degradation of the media ecosystem as probably anyone on the planet, but I do see, signs such as the New Yorker site used to have one of those most popular boxes, and they just got rid of it because they said, this isn't meaningful, this isn't useful to our editorial mission. Wow. And not that the New Yorker isn't editorially interested in Kim Kardashian, but that the balance between climate change and Kardashians is not, primarily traffic generated. So, that's not a representative example, but I just want people to not think that everything is only moving in one direction.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that that's true. And I think even Gawker, they're starting to move, a little bit away from this stuff, even as I was leaving. So, but the Times was starting to look at it more. So, I think it's right. It's not monodirectional.
Yeah. And then just to end up, I mean, I just, the one thing I think that would be nice to leave us on is you have this sort of summing up line of, I'll quote you, if metrics driven journalism was supposed to be a Faustian bargain, the devil has yet to deliver on his end. So just to sort of say, like, what would constitute, I mean, I guess the question is just, you know, briefly before we go, you've told us there isn't a golden metric that's going to solve all of this for us.
Right.
You've told us that, you know, that none of this is in a simple causal relationship. Is there any way that Faustian bargain could be satisfied? Or is this just, you know, one of these things where the market and the mission don't really fit?
This is a big question, right? Like, this is something that I still wrestle with. You know, I think I wrote that line when I was starting to see companies that had sort of gone all in on like social media distribution, like BuzzFeed, like they had sort of figured this all out and they were the ones everyone was looking to. And all of a sudden, you know, they're laying off 15% of their staff. I was like, oh my gosh, you know, if it's not working for them, how is this going to work? I think, you know, I think that the tensions are systemic. Like, I think that they are, you know, they exist like in journalism and have sort of since the get-go. That is not to say that this is hopeless, because I think we've seen that there are definitely policy decisions that can be made that can support kind of a more robust, civically valuable media system. And, you know, and some of them have kind of historical precedent in this country. And, you know, you can range like, you know, it's a range of how much you think, you know, you would want the government to kind of, for instance, provide market subsidies, this kind of thing, material support, right? This is very controversial. But I think it's something to be considering, right? Like the role of public media, does it have more of a role to play? But even if you don't want to go there, you know, there's just in terms of kind of the merger mania that's taken over journalism, the fact that most of like ownership caps and things like that have gone by the wayside and so on. You know, that is stuff that can be solved at a policy level, that can be changed at a policy level. And I think some of that would help, you know, help to kind of ease the tensions a little bit. So I think the tensions are there. I don't think there's going to be perfect alignment, but I think that, you know, we do, you know, have some power here to make decisions like at a policy level, and also the organizing that's going on in newsrooms, I think is again very hopeful for this. So I think that there are things that can happen to improve or to just ameliorate that tension a little bit more than is currently happening. And I hope that we kind of get pushed to that point. Like, I think, you know, I think I'm seeing sort of rumblings of it more and more now, and you know, and an FCC that may start to move in this direction. So we'll see.
Yeah, I mean, now seems like it would be the time. Excellent. Okay, well, thank you so much for your time. Thanks to everyone for the questions. This has been really informative.
Thank you so much. It was just wonderful questions. Thank you. And thanks, Andrew. Thank you for your commentary and questions too.
Absolutely.
Caitlin and Andrew, thank you so much for coming to Open Book, Open Mind for this illuminating, riveting, and sometimes alarming discussion.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks.
We had one last question that I want to answer. I want to say that I love here. Kathleen says, I do feel sorry for the poor man who talked with his analyst about his metrics. He needs to go out west and buy a farm.
I don't know. Farming is probably also quite stressful.
Yeah, very hard metrics and
very hard
farming.
metrics
Very hard
with the farming. Yeah.
But you know, even librarians worry about metrics, and I recognize that thing with the bar, because I will sometimes for one of these programs, I'll just keep checking how many people have signed up.
Wow.
How many people have signed up? And librarians will ask each other, you know, the first question is, well, so how did it go? How many people showed up? And, you know, we worry about how books circulate. We don't have to worry about how many people buy them, but we worry about how many people borrow them. So numbers are, you know, king in many, in maybe every industry in some way or another. But we are just so grateful that you were able to come. And I also want to thank our audience, because as I always say, without you, we're nothing. And
very apropos to the topic of discussion.
True, without you, we're nothing. That was so brilliant, Caitlin. Thank you for that. I needed that. And I wanted to say that all the news that's fit to click, and also Antisocial by Andrew Marantz, are available for sale by our partner Watch on Booksellers, and they're also available to borrow through the library. This is the moment when I just remind everybody that writers deserve to be paid, and that if you like a writer's work, if you think what they're doing is valuable, if you want to support this kind of work and you want these people to come back to Open Book, Open Mind, you'll consider purchasing their books. There's no higher compliment to an author than buying their book. So
Borrowing it from the library is also good.
And borrowing it from the library is also good. Finally, we hope you'll join us for our next event on Thursday, February 10th at 7 p.m. We'll be hosting Jeremy W. Peters, a correspondent for the New York Times, about his new book, Insurgency: How Republicans Lost Their Party and Got Everything They Ever Wanted. Be well, and we hope to see you next time. Thanks again.
Thanks all.
Bye.